get going. Terrific to see you all. Thanks for coming out in somewhat challenging and unusual weather. For those of you I've not met before, my name is Melinda Hinkson. I'm here with two hats on tonight. I'm the Director of the Institute of Post-Colonial Studies and also an Arena Publications editor. We're very pleased to be co-hosting this second discussion on matters of geopolitical and existential importance. For those of you who may have missed last month's nuclear discussion, you can catch the film via the IPCS website or a podcast via Arena, whichever you prefer. Now, in acknowledging that we meet tonight on the customary lands of Wurundjeri people, I feel somewhat compelled to reflect very briefly, but to reflect nonetheless on the forthcoming referendum. As will be painfully aware and obvious to all in this room, the debate around the voice to Parliament continues to expose many dark fault lines in Australian society. Whether yes or no prevails, there will be considerable social, emotional, psychological and political fallout. One of the striking aspects of this mess, and I, like many other people at this point, think it's a mess, is that the government that has set this process in train has done so by invoking an attitude of settler innocence. Albanese's mantra, "It's just an advisory body," adopted by yes advocates in their desperate attempt to diffuse the No Scare campaign, is just one obvious example of this. To fudge the question of structural reckoning in such glib terms indicates that the government lacks insight as well as political inclination to intervene in the toxic politics that have exploded in recent weeks. Neo-assimilationism and the brutal politics of racialised hatred and disregard have acquired a newly supercharged lease of life. The possibility of having a reasoned national discussion about Australia's enduring colonial legacies has been missed, yet again. The dizzying spectrum of interpretation over what the voice might or might not give rise to reveals the deeply fraught status of truth-telling in the present. If we look squarely at the phrase, "It's just an advisory body," we have other reasons to be muted in any enthusiasm we might have for the success of yes. One issue that has gone largely unaddressed in debate is the cultured workings of government. For all the euphoric, transformative potential that has been loaded onto the voice, history shows that advocacy guarantees very little in the politics of policy making, with perhaps the obvious exception of the fossil fuel and defence lobbyists. In an editorial in Arena Quarterly a couple of issues ago, John Altman and I wrote that the best possible hope for the voice, if it gets up, is that it is a Trojan horse, a holding place for a set of political arrangements to come, of a kind that we have not yet seen in Australia. In other words, there is plenty of reason to cynically expect that the voice will indeed be just an advisory body. Now, if there is a thread of connection here to tonight's discussion, aside from the scaremongering that suggests the voice will actually have a say on AUKUS, is perhaps on this question of the culture of governance. At a time when strong and determined national leadership is urgently required on so many fronts, we are led by governments that continue to duck or outsource responsibility for matters as vital as national identity and national security. We are arguably caught in the crosshairs of two related kinds of unresolved identity: settler colonial nation on the one hand, neo-imperial understudy on the other, to invoke Clinton's work. No doubt tonight's discussion will roam well across all of these matters. So thank you very much for your indulgence. I'm going to hand over now to Alison Caddick, editor of Arena Quarterly, who will introduce tonight's panel and chair the discussion.
Thanks, Melinda. And again, hi to everybody. Great to see so many people here tonight. I'm not going to introduce the discussion. We're going to get down to business. We've got 4 speakers tonight. They're all people with much experience and very thoughtful people in this area. The topic, or the title that we chose, was Bombs Bursting in Our Air, AUKUS, Australia and the Course Set for War, ? Our first speaker tonight is Clinton Fernandes. Clinton is probably known to you. He's certainly a very welcome contributor to ARENA over the last several years. He's a professor at the University of New South Wales and leader of the Future Operations Group there, and of course the author of Sub-Imperialism. So straight over to you, thanks, Clinton.
Thank you. The group has no leader. It's just a group of people who just decided to research things in the group. It doesn't have a voice as such. It's individuals have views and do research and so on. Anyway, look, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because these other guys have all got notes, and I just thought I'd speak extemporaneously. For 10 minutes, yep. And so I talked with Alison about 2 weeks before about what to say. I just cover generally what my own research in the Future Operations Research Group has to say about the technology and the changes that have occurred, because it'll help you make sense of some of the headlines. If you don't understand why ministers are saying this or that, or why American officials are saying one thing or another, or North Korean or whoever, it's because there are a couple of things that have occurred in the last 20 years, really a lot in the last, say, 5 years, that have changed the character of war, and they have not really been reported by the press and even by most journals. There are certain technical journals like Science and Global Security that does cover this. So here we go. Basically, the nature of war remains the same. It's a contest of will. It's contains elements of the irrational and things like that. So that's eternal. But the character of war has changed dramatically, perhaps without any precedent at all, over the last 20 years. And what I'm referring to are 2 revolutions that have occurred. One of them is what's called the sensing revolution, and the other one is what's called the precision revolution. So the sensing revolution, in the past, you could hide in a certain way. I mean, and of course submarines can still hide, but there were certain things that were harder to that were harder to find. Things like missile silos, and certainly transporter erector launchers. That's missiles that are on the back of trucks and they drive around. You can, they're solid fuel, so you can just park them and fire and then move on. Well, in the last, say, 20 years, there's been a sensing revolution with synthetic aperture radar, drones, night vision, much sharper resolution, the ability to see through clouds, the ability to see through foliage, to get satellite imagery of about maybe even a 4-inch level resolution. So no longer can you just hope to see a truck, you can now see the number plate and read it. And what that means is it's complicated one pillar of any country's nuclear capability. Nuclear capability relies on that capability being impregnable, right? You have to have a survivable second strike in order to have a nuclear deterrent. But now you can actually figure out almost exactly where another country's nuclear weapons are. So there are 3 tactics that are used to protect your nuclear deterrent. One of them is hardening, the other one is concealment, and the third is redundancy. The sensing revolution has reduced the concealment option. You can now have a satellite flying across a known North Korean missile base, and it'll cover basically the entire territory of North Korea, all the roads in a day. You can get imagery of all that. And you can basically image it every hour if you want, depending on the number of birds you put up in the sky. Plus there are other Global Hawk drones and so on. So the hardening, concealment, and redundancy. Concealment is now very weak. A rich country like China or the United States can fight against that by building more missile silos. A poor country like North Korea cannot. Hardening has been complicated by the precision revolution. So the sensing revolution And then there's a precision revolution. It's now possible to attack another country's nuclear forces, not just their cities. In nuclear doctrine, there is counter value, where you hit another country's city, and there's counter force, where you actually hit their force's ability to use nuclear weapons. That includes leadership strikes, because that's part of the force. And the precision revolution has almost completely eliminated hardening. Okay? It is now possible to land sub-kiloton nuclear weapons at a ground burst without causing radioactive fallout. So what happens is, normally there's two kinds of bursts. There's an air burst, which puts huge overpressure and destroys buildings and so on. But if a nuclear silo is underneath it, it's hardened and it can't be destroyed. The way you destroy that is by hitting with a ground burst. You actually hit it on the ground, but most of the energy in the nuclear weapon is actually in the ground. So it digs out the ground, and then it takes it up into the air, and the upper air is radioactive. It's got gamma rays, X-rays, neutrons. And it's this radioactive dust, and the dust flows across and begins falling out. That's called nuclear fallout. Right? So in other words, it can kill people who are not even part of the conflict, like another country. The precision revolution has eliminated the chance of fallout. You can now destroy another country's nuclear weapons without causing fallout. The only people who'd really die would be the technicians on a site. That's it. Unless, of course, their weapons are right in the middle of a city. But generally speaking, you could not. So a lot of what's going on in northern Australia right now, with the building of new, not just Northern Territory, but even northwestern Australia, with the space facilities, and the garrisoning, I guess, of northern Australia to fill it up with more and more American capabilities, these are not missiles that will be located there, but the surveillance facilities that will allow the missiles to be targeted. In the past, you had a satellite up in the air, and then you had somebody at Pine Gap actually doing the processing to get the photography, to make sure that the camera, that's exactly the right photograph you want. Today, the satellites is 4,000 in Starlink, and there's a number of other constellations of satellites. But the processing can actually be done on board the satellites themselves, rather than down in Pine Gap. So the purposes of Pine Gap is changing, but also the concealment of any adversary is also reducing. So the three options: hardening, concealment, and redundancy. Hardening has been just defeated now by the precision revolution. Concealment has been largely eroded by the sensing revolution, and all that's left now is redundancy. So we basically, arms control, in a way, is dead, because countries now, including China, want to have more and more silos in order to prevent their own counterforce defeat. Right? That's the kind of thing that the policy officials in defense and the Pentagon talk about when they meet behind closed doors at the OSMID meetings and at the policy official level. Okay, that's the kind of thing that is being discussed. And so our entire stance is when Richard Marles, the defense minister, talks about the missile age, that statement that this is preparing Australia for the missile age, what he's not saying is what I just said, that the missile age means using precision to eliminate hardening, using accuracy to eliminate, using sensing to eliminate concealment, and then all that's left is redundancy. I think that's where I'll end it. It gives you the basics. I've stayed away from the physics and so on, but if you have any technical questions, feel free to ask. That's it for me.
Okay, well, the speakers are going to speak for 10 minutes. We were going to allow people to ask any purely informational question per speaker before we open to general discussion a bit further down the track. So if there are any specific questions for Clinton at this point, do put your hand up.
What does redundancy mean in this circumstance? Building more missile silos. It means building more missile silos. So in Xinjiang, for example, in the western parts of China, there are more and more missile silos being built by China. In Xinjiang, in the western part, in order to make it harder for the United States to destroy their forces. Because if you've got more and more missile forces, it just takes many more of US missiles to destroy their silos. So when people talk about China's military buildup and their missile buildup, That's what the build-up is. They're trying to preserve their own force. It's a survival strategy rather than an aggressive strategy, if you see what I'm saying. The other thing is that China will not ratify any kind of arms reduction agreement because they've only got 300 nukes, whereas the United States and Russia have about 5,000 each. So they're not going to. They want to also use redundancy to give themselves more and more options to shoot. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Obviously, with concealment, one of the issues is underwater.
Yeah.
In terms of sensing, is there still an ability to hide nuclear weapons in the sea?
The submarines and so on. Yeah, the submarines are still secure. When people talk about a transparent ocean, I mean they may mean something 100 years from now. Or, the air has always been the air domain has always been transparent, but you still have stealth aircraft, and so the undersea environment is still very secure. Depending on how deep the boats are, in the Taiwan Strait it's pretty shallow, but in deep waters it's extremely secure. Yeah, but even there are hydrophones buried on the floor of the oceans at choke points in order to record the acoustic signature of submarines, and that's called the SOSUS, S-O-S-U-S. You can look it up. It's the SOSUS project. Yep.
Is there some comparative advantage that China or the US has in relation to the sensing and precision revolutions you talked about?
The United States is far ahead in everything. Far ahead. For its purposes, which are global. I've called it imperial, but in a certain way. For China, I believe they have the advantage in the Taiwan Strait. China has the advantage in the Taiwan Strait, yeah, no question. In fact, there was an interview with 4 people done by John Lyons on the ABC. If you Google that, I was one of the people. I explained why there. I talk about the center of gravity, the sensing, the radars, and how the China can hold off. In brief, China can deny air control to the United States. Okay, the United States cannot, if it cannot control the air, it cannot win on land or at sea. Nor can any military that's been built in its image. When they closed Bagram Air Base, the Afghan government collapsed. The United States' doctrine, its whole way of fighting, is to have air control. And if it can't have air control, it can't win at land or at sea. China has the anti-air forces to eliminate any chance of US air control, and it can do it for years.
Any further questions?
Détente. In which country? I just don't know. I have no idea. The environment is just not there, right? I mean, that's not a professional assessment by me on a technical level. Just looking at it from politics, like anybody else can. It should be tried, of course. But yeah.
Okay, well, there will certainly be more questions and discussion around some of that in discussion time. So thanks, Clinton. Our next speaker is Jenny Grounds, and Jenny is a rural GP, among many other things, by the sounds of things, currently the treasurer of the Medical
Association for Prevention of War.
There we are. So thanks very much, Jenny.
So, MAP. Is that okay? MAPW is a group of health professionals, and that's the sort of, we come from a health perspective on everything. I thought I'd just set the context. My talk's going to be very different to Clinton's, but as a health professional, I would diagnose Australia as being addicted to war. And we have a lot of reasons to frame things that way. I mean, Anzac has become such a glorification of war and a national foundation myth. The Australian War Memorial keeps on being, has become an extravagant museum of war toys. And the government now takes its advice on military matters from think tanks, which are actually funded, not completely, but considerably by the weapons industry. Spending on diplomacy has plummeted while defence spending is increasing. Our savings in superannuation and the Future Fund are still invested in weapons companies, and in particular in nuclear weapons companies. and MAPW is doing a lot of work around that. We aim to be in the top 10 weapons manufacturers in the world. And there's a conflict of interest and a culture of coziness, it's been said, between weapons companies and politicians, and the revolving door of politicians getting offered jobs in weapons companies, within days often of retiring from Parliament, and even suspiciously at the same time, in some cases. And some of you know about Undue Influence, which is an organisation run by Michelle Fay, who's researching these sorts of revolving door things that are going on between government and industry, especially the weapons industry. The weapons industry is also infiltrating education, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And we're following the US into wars, as we have done since World War II, which we didn't have to do to defend our own country. And now we've got AUKUS, which is a rejection of Europe and at the same time an alienation of China and a return to an Anglosphere with policies more and more relying again on the policies of nuclear deterrence. So in the Defence Strategy Review that was done earlier this year, the terms of reference included the word seamless interoperability, which Clinton has suggested is the case with between Australia and the US on these militaristic issues and the development of so much more in the way of connections and Australia being used as a place like Pine Gap, like the bases in the north, for the US to launch its wars from. And nuclear-powered subs are the flagship of the AUKUS fleet. So I'll talk a little bit about the nuclear-powered subs and the health risks that they represent to Australia. But of course, we're not going to see them for a long time, although they will be visiting our ports. And the nuclear exposure risk is real. We've done a little bit of research into this. Obviously, in the ports where nuclear subs are serviced and built, the risk would be higher than just visiting nuclear ships, but the ones that do visit nuclear-powered warships and subs that visit Australia now are carefully monitored by, and the monitoring has to be reported to our PANZER, which is our current nuclear regulatory body. But what happens with AUKUS is, and what's going to be happening with the nuclear subs is, that there is a development of a new regulatory body which is going to be embedded right in defence, and the very one of the consultancy groups that have been criticised so strongly in recent years, Ernst & Young, has been given a nice comfortable sum to develop this nuclear regulatory body, and it's surrounded by secrecy because it's going to be within defence now. So our PANZER, which has always, been involved with Lucas Heights and other aspects of nuclear stuff in Australia, has been pushed aside. So what happens if there is a meltdown? Obviously a meltdown of any nuclear power plant, whether it's on a submarine or anywhere else, will release gamma radiation from the vessel or from the plant, and radioactive plumes which can travel long distances. And when a nuclear-powered sub melts down, it also releases them, of course, into the seawater surrounding. The first thing to worry about is radioactive iodine, apart from the immediate gamma radiation. And that is, the risk from that is mainly of thyroid cancer in people who are exposed to it, but of course general radiation as well. And the risk of problems with radioactive iodine can be abated by having stable iodine on hand for people who are exposed to ingest within the next 24 hours, to block the thyroid gland with iodine so that the radioactive iodine doesn't get to go in there. Thyroid gland in the neck that produces thyroid hormone. So how is this going to happen? It's not already happening in Australian ports that have nuclear-powered warships visiting. There is a new rule in Japan that allows for any community living around a nuclear power plant to already have that iodine on hand. Is that going to happen in Australia in these ports? We don't know. And it's very hard to get this information. MAPW did some research into what was currently available in the way of safety regulations and found that there was some fairly outdated medical information that things were based on, what they could find out, which was difficult, and that it was, that there weren't very carefully regulated plans or safety plans in existence. And certainly the communities that have been proposed for the subs are very concerned about these issues. And we plan to do some more work on developing information for these communities. Because we're coming from a health perspective again. And of course, cesium-137, another radioactive isotope, is also a problem with any nuclear meltdown, or even a less significant event than a nuclear meltdown with releases. And there have been, since 1963, there have been 5 confirmed nucleotide releasing accidents relating to nuclear-powered military vessels, and 6 vessels that have sunk entirely, potentially releasing these isotopes into the surrounding water. So secrecy is a big problem with all of this. It's hard for us, the public, to find out what's going to be happening around port safety and community safety with these subs. And in August, our government... Oh, no, sorry, I've talked about that. So we asked the questions, what's planned about informing the public? How will the capacity in ports to deal with nuclear releases be established? And will there be distribution of iodine to civilians? And how are we going to train the civil hospitals and health facilities and community health workers to prepare for this worst case scenario? And there's lots of questions around this. But a lot of people say, well, I'm not worried about the subs because I don't reckon that we'll ever get them. It'll just be pie in the sky and it'll never happen. But we're already enmeshing with the US by sharing more and more technology. And as Clinton said, this is happening already. And this is the biggest concern, I think, about AUKUS, because it's pushing us in the direction of an offensive country instead of a defence force that protects us. It's pushing us out there into the world as an aggressive warmongering country. And the health impacts on Chinese civilians in Australia are already being felt around the community because of the racism that's generated by things like the red alert media coverage that the Age and Sydney Morning Herald did earlier, I think it was earlier this year, scaremongering about war with China, which our politicians of a certain type like to do as well. I just want to touch briefly on the invasion of education by weapons companies. There's a lot of that happening. There has been for a long time, and MAPW's done some work on this. We've written a report, Miners and Missiles, which is available on our website, and it outlines the companies that are involved. Many of them are big weapons companies. The top 10 manufacturers are all developing programs, competitions, subsidising other organisations to run STEM education things in schools. And indeed, since BAE Systems has been named as the main developer of the future AUKUS subs, they have run already 2 programs or subsidised 2 programs in Australia. The Subs in Schools program, which I think is finished. It was a competition in secondary schools. And then in primary schools, they're now rolling out a thing called the Beacon program, which is primary schools in the states where there possibly could be subs being built in the future. And this is all rolled out with a whole lot of PR, which is alarmist about the lack of trained people in nuclear physics in Australia and how we need them desperately to start being rolled off the shelf in schools. It's a big worry. There are so many other things that are so much more important for people going into STEM to do. Climate change being the obvious one, abolition of nuclear weapons, and all of the environmental areas that we need to work in that involve children who've been encouraged to go into STEM, not building weapons. I mean, how regressive is it to promote STEM as an area that can lead to jobs in weapons building? So we need to oppose AUKUS for lots of reasons. And the very least the Albanese government should do is to sign the new treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. They've agreed to do that in several Labor Party forums, and they did it again at the last conference just recently. It would show that Australia has no intention of relying on nuclear deterrence, and that it's not going to support the use of nuclear weapons in any way. And I think we should be urging our government to do that, and MAPW will continue to work with ICAN, the Nobel Peace Prize winning organisation that we helped to set up in Australia, who developed this treaty. We would like to see Australia sign on. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Jenny. Any questions, brief questions for Jenny? Clarifying questions? No? Okay, we'll come back to some of that too, I'm sure, Jenny. Thanks very much. Now, Nick Maclellan will speak to us. Nick is a reporter and researcher with many, many long years of work and involvement, political and research-wise, in the Pacific, and he's going to be addressing the question of AUKUS and the Pacific. Thanks very much, Nick.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks for the invitation. I want to acknowledge we meet on Aboriginal land, never ceded. I work in the Pacific Islands as a journalist, and I've been talking over the last couple of years with both government and community leaders about their response to what it means in the region at a time of incredible geopolitical context. And I'll come to what Pacific Islanders are saying, but before that I just want to flag a few things about the issue of AUKUS and regional relations, because I think we need to look beyond nuclear submarines to look at the broader strategy. And part of the bane of my life as a journalist is to spend time sitting outside summit meetings waiting for people to stop going blah, 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 and then trying to read the tea leaves of communiques and declarations and so on. But every now and then you find in these policy statements some real gems that really do set agendas, and I think it's worth reading their documents sometimes. And a year ago, the Biden administration put out their first national security statement. And it's a document well worth reading for people who are interested in engaging with AUKUS. And it's got lots of stuff about freedom and, free and open Indo-Pacific and lots of blah, blah, blah. But buried in there is a real explanation of what they're doing. And they talk quite openly about investing at home and aligning with allies. Investing at home through things like the CHIPS Act, trying to build up American technological capacities, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a sort of misnamed subsidy to the corporate sector in terms of infrastructure and a whole range of areas of competition with China. And they say that both investing at home, aligning with allies, is, and I quote, vital for outcompeting the People's Republic of China in the technological, economic, political, military, intelligence and global governance domains. It's a pretty broad agenda of what they're on about. Yeah? And they state, quote, that the US will prioritise maintaining an enduring competitive edge over the People's Republic of China while constraining a still dangerous Russia. Obviously, therefore, the intervention with NATO